I miss my mother. It's not what I expected to hear from an ISIS suicide bomber. Ahmed Qasib al-Khatib had a boyish face, but he spoke with unwavering confidence about his sacred mission. His clumsy arrogance reminded me more of a rebellious teenager than a ruthless terrorist. Our encounter was in Duhok prison in Iraq's Kurdish region. I'd come to see the Yazidi survivors, victims of genocide, branded as devil worshippers by ISIS. But I was equally compelled to understand the psychology of the perpetrators, the roots of their hatred and violence that had destroyed so many lives. 16-year-old Ahmed had been captured crossing at the Syrian border. His suicide vest had failed to explode. Now he was behind bars, deprived of both freedom and the glory of martyrdom. He lectured me on his toxic theology. He demonstrated the success of the emirs in exploiting the desperation of impressionable youth for the diabolical cause of the so-called caliphate. The male narcissistic rage on display wasn't surprising. I'd witnessed it before in Bosnia, in Rwanda, and so many other war zones around the world. A train wreck of shame, humiliation, and trauma, Ahmed had nothing to lose. In joining ISIS, he had suddenly found an identity, an illusion of power. That illusion had now crumbled, exposing a confused and vulnerable adolescent rethinking his life choices. As he was being taken back to his prison cell by the guards, I heard him mumble, "I miss my mother. I wish I could turn time back and go to school. I wanted to become a doctor." How had Ahmed the healer become Ahmed the killer? What would make a young man with dreams and ambitions choose death over life? The power of the primal bond with his mother perhaps offered a clue. Having lost everything, it was a lifeline to the most meaningful connection that he knew. Teenage suicide, as I'd come to understand, was about extreme despair, a want of the bonds that make life worth living. It was a question of mental health, not religious ideology. Maybe in another universe closer to my reality, I would have encountered Ahmed hanging around a shopping mall, texting his girlfriend on the latest iPhone. Instead of fighting a holy war, he would be fighting boredom with a wide range of electronic distractions at his fingertips. For him, the scenes of carnage in Iraq and Syria would be no more than a Facebook post. But whether afflicted by catastrophic war or consumerist emptiness, one way or another, he would have to grapple with what it means to live and die in a world of extremes. Whether in the prison or the shopping mall, there would be no escape from the perennial problem of how the depth of our connections distinguishes a meaningless life from a meaningful death. Getting rid of lice is not a question of ideology. It is a matter of cleanliness. The words are seemingly innocuous until we appreciate the context. The date was April 24, 1943, in Kharkov, occupied Soviet Ukraine. Heinrich Himmler was motivating the Nazi SS to exterminate Jews on the Eastern Front. But the soldiers needed to overcome the reluctance to murder the innocent. In his trial before the Nuremberg Tribunal, one of the commanders, Paul Blobel, complained that his men suffered from nervous exhaustion, that they experienced a lot psychologically. Himmler sought to reassure them. Anti-Semitism, he explained, is exactly the same as delousing. The Holocaust, it has been said, did not begin in the gas chambers. It began with words. cockroaches and lice, snakes and rats, the dehumanization of others is always a precondition for their destruction. We cannot harm those for whom we have empathy. The perpetrator must first convince himself that his cruelty is in the name of a greater good, a glorious act of cleansing and purification. The demonization of others is less about the reality of the victim and more about the needs of the perpetrator, a projection of his own fragile self-image. As Jean-Paul Sartre famously said, if the Jew did not exist, the anti-Semite would invent him. Scapegoating has little regard to the facts. It begins with a convenient myth that, repeated enough times, becomes the incontestable truth. On October 27th, just a week ago, a gunman walked into the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh and murdered 11 Jewish worshippers. Here in Canada, on January 29, 2017, another gunman walked into a mosque in Quebec City and murdered 6 Muslim worshippers. Prior to that, a gunman had walked into a church in Charleston, South Carolina, and murdered 9 African American worshippers. With the disease of populist hatred spreading in our midst, should we be surprised? Should we indulge in wishful thinking that things could not get even worse? All that it takes for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. The consumerist culture that celebrates greed and narcissism, the corruption and cowardice of political life sanitized by empty liberal platitudes, the exploitation of rage among alienated masses by shameless demagogues, this is the fertile ground in which hatred and violence has always thrived. Yet, in all the gloomy examples that I offered, the astonishing resilience of the human spirit was also on display. Jews and Muslims, blacks and whites, joined hands in transcendent defiance against divisive hatred. The light shineth in the darkness, but the darkness knoweth it not. We must never underestimate the power of our own empathy, the power of spiritual transformation. More so than ever before, communities of faith must arise and become the cause of unification among all peoples. Here in Canada, we must accelerate our efforts at achieving reconciliation and justice for our Indigenous brothers and sisters. The world is tired of empty words. Let us show in our actions what it truly means to worship the divine, to realize the inherent dignity that defines our deepest nature, the shared humanity that reminds us of our essential oneness. The vision of a world civilization embracing all peoples was once the distant dream of prophets and poets. Today, it is our inescapable future. Far from being a romantic ideal, our inextricable interdependence is a reality that we can only ignore at our own peril. We must either embrace our oneness with courage and volition, or we will be forced to do so after unimaginable catastrophes leave us with no other choice. But the journey to the better world that we seek cannot be undertaken without sacrificial struggle. The candle that is the human soul cannot give forth its light without burning. I learned that lesson powerfully when I was 16 years of age. Mona Mahmoud-Nejad was my contemporary from the persecuted Baha'i community in Iran, the land of my birth, the land of my ancestors. A victim of hatred and fanaticism, she was arrested for writing a high school essay demanding freedom of conscience and belief. When news arrived that Mona had been hanged, it shattered my world. It cut through my complacency like a knife. I asked myself, why her and not me? The only difference between us was that my family had the good fortune of exile in Canada, while her family had remained behind in Iran. It made me ask, what was my freedom worth in Canada if it was wasted on selfish mediocrity? In a rising in the name of compassion and justice, we are nobody's savior except our own. In fighting apathy and hatred with empathy and humanity, we are merely retrieving our own authenticity. We are distinguishing a meaningless life from a meaningful death. In memory of Mona, I will end with these words of Baha'u'llah, the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith, that we learned as children in Iran. O son of justice, whither can a lover go but to the land of his beloved? And what seeker findeth rest away from his heart's desire? To the true lover, reunion is life, and separation is death. His breast is void of patience, and his heart hath no peace. A myriad lives he would forsake to hasten to the abode of his beloved. Thank you for your patience. Thank you.